Reformed Faces Session 3. Some people may ask questions like these. How come there are so many denominations? I mean, how come there are so many Reformed denominations? OPC, PCA, RPNA, Bible Presbyterian, CRC, not to mention Korean denominations such as Presbyterian Hopdong, Presbyterian Donghop. Why so many denominations? What are they? We will answer these questions with 6 historical factors. The first factor is the geography of Europe. Well, Europe was made up of many, many different countries. What we call Germany today was made up of about 200 dukedoms and various principalities. And so when the gospel spread after Luther and Calvin began to study the Bible and discover the gospel, well, then very naturally, the churches that emerged had something to do with either the permission given by the rulers or perhaps in some cases the rulers themselves adopted the Protestant faith. And so Martin Luther's approach was to try to persuade a prince or duke to adopt the gospel. And so in Germany, what we call Germany today, some of these rulers did and became Lutheran. Most of them are in what we call northern Germany and eastern Germany. Others did not listen to Luther and remained Roman Catholic. Many of these were in the south. For example, some of us have heard of the movie Sound of Music. That story, a true story, took place in Salzburg, Austria. Now, Austria, the term Austria or Österreich simply means the eastern region, eastern realm, and it was a German-speaking territory. And we know, as the story goes, that Austria was mainly Roman Catholic. The star of The Sound of Music was a nun. Okay, so in certain parts, particularly in the south of Germany, they were Roman Catholic. In the north, they were mostly Protestant, but that is not consistent. So Germany looks like a checkerboard. Calvinism, the Reformed faith, spread in France, but the young graduate from Calvin Seminary, who went back to France, lasted about 18 months before he was killed. And so the French Huguenot or Reformed Church was mostly underground and barely could survive. There were Reformed churches in Germany, Holland, Scotland, England, Hungary, and so on. Then there was the Church of England. Finally, there were Mennonite or Amish and the Baptist churches in Germany. So just in the 16th century alone, there were 4 wings, 4 movements, you might say 4 denominations: Lutheran, Reformed or Presbyterian, Anglican, and Anabaptist. The second factor has to do with the decline and the revival of the church in England throughout the centuries. From about 1555 to about 1710, 16th century mostly, there were different kinds of churches, you might say. All of them would not accept the king or the queen as the head of the church in England. All of them would not accept bishops to run over their faith and their church life. They were Congregationalists, they were Presbyterians, some were independent. And then among the Congregationalists were Baptists. By the 18th century, revival broke out. And then at the end of the revival, by the 1780s and 90s, the Methodist Church was born. In the 19th century, certain parts of the United Kingdom, like Ireland and England, there were people who were dissatisfied with the coldness of the Church of England. So the Brethren movement was began. So we talked about Congregationalists and Presbyterians, Baptists, part of the Congregational, Methodist, 18th century, Brethren in the 19th century. All of them, you might say, were born out of revival in the Church of England. Well, what about the churches in Germany and Scandinavia? Well, there were so-called revivals as well. Or maybe revival is not the right term. There were people in Germany and Northern Europe that believed in a more alive, vibrant relationship with Jesus Christ. And so the Moravian brothers were born in the 18th century. Today, in the United States and in China, in Chinese-speaking world, we speak of 信义宗, the Lutheran Church, and then we speak of 路德会, which in American English would be the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And then there were other smaller Lutheran denominations. In Norway, those who did not want to believe in the state religion in the Lutheran Church of Norway eventually became what we today know as the Evangelical Free Church. The term evangelical simply means Protestant. The term free simply means they do not want their churches to be under government control. Evangelical Free Church, 播道会. In Sweden, such a parallel church would be called the Evangelical Covenant Church. So both in the German-speaking world and Scandinavia and in the English-speaking world, there were revival movements or movements toward a more alive, vibrant Christian life, which then led to the birth of new denominations. The third factor is that immigrants from Europe, from Scotland, Ireland, England, went to North America. For example, the first Baptist church was formed shortly after 1620 near Boston. First Congregational Church shortly after 1630 in Boston. First Presbyterian Church from Scotland, 1689 in Maryland. And then the first presbytery from these Scottish or Irish Presbyterian churches, 1707, First Synod, 1716, and finally the Presbyterian Church in the USA General Assembly, 1789. So immigrants brought their churches to North America. I only outlined both the Congregational and the Presbyterians. Actually, by the 18th century, long before the American Revolution of 1776, Philadelphia was 1/3 German, not to mention the Swiss, not to mention the Swedish, for example. So there were all kinds of German churches, Lutherans, of course, and then some of these Moravian kind of pietists, and the Swedish church. Very much part of the life of Philadelphia long before the USA was born. We are not to forget that among the immigrants to North America were black slaves, which were forced to come to America. By the time they were freed, or some of them were freed, some of these black churches become denominations. Among Methodists, they're called the African Methodist Episcopal Church. One among many black Baptist denominations is called the National Baptist Convention. So there were many Methodist and Baptist black denominations in America. The fourth factor is the Civil War in the United States, 1861 to 1865. The issue, of course, that divided the country was slavery. And so as soon as war broke out in 1861, many denominations divided into two. The Presbyterian Church was then called the Presbyterian Church USA for the North, and the Presbyterian Church United States in the South. For Methodists, the Northern Church was called the Methodist Episcopal Church. The Southern Methodist churches were called the Methodist Episcopal Church South, in parentheses. So when they went to China, the Methodist Episcopal Church was called Mei Yi Mei Hui, whereas the Methodist Episcopal South was called Jian Li Zhong, or maybe in some cases, 巡礼中. My mother was a graduate of Soochow University, 东吴大学, which was mainly started by the Methodist Episcopal Church South, 监理中. Among the Baptists, the Northern Baptist Convention, of course, was the name for the North, and the Southern Baptist Convention was the name for the South, which eventually became, for a long time, the largest denomination in America. So because of war, many denominations split into two, particularly Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist. Fifth factor is the rise of liberal theology. That is, ministers and elders no longer believed that the Bible contained miracles actually happened, and so on. And so by 1936, some of these Bible-believing Presbyterian ministers were expelled from the Presbyterian Church, United States of America, and they formed what later on became the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in 1936. Well, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church of 1936 immediately broke into two, and the ones that left the OPC are called the Bible Presbyterian Church, BPs. But the Bible Presbyterian Church split because some of these pastors could no longer tolerate a tyrannical autocrat at the head of the denomination, so they formed what is called the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod. And that group of very loving Presbyterian churches eventually joined the PCA in 1982. I outlined for you what happened in the northern part of the United States. 1936, OPC, BP, and then by 1950s and 60s, the RPCES, which then joined the PCA in 1982. In the South, Southern Presbyterian pastors were calling for their church to be faithful to the Bible ever since 1941. By 1966, they formed a Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, to no avail. And so finally, in 1973, a group of several hundred churches formed the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America. So the PCA came out of the PCUS in the South, whereas in 1973, whereas the OPC came out of the North in 1936, 37 years apart. In the 1940s, some Bible-believing Baptist churches could no longer accept the liberal views of many of these Northern Baptist Convention leaders, so they formed what is called the Conservative Baptist Association of America. That denomination eventually broke apart, and so they have Conservative Baptist Associations in various states, but no longer national denomination. But their foreign mission society was quite influential for decades. It was called the Conservative Baptist Foreign Mission Society, CBFMS. Among the Episcopals or the Anglican churches, there was a group of conservative churches that broke out in the early 1970s. They became known as the Anglican Church of North America. Into the 20th century, there were quite a few exoduses of Episcopalian churches, and they formed different denominations or they went different directions. Number 6. Finally, the sixth factor is that as churches or pastors and Christians began to spread the gospel, particularly among the poor in the West, then went abroad, then naturally some new denominations were born. First, the Salvation Army in 1865. The Salvation Army didn't begin to become a denomination. They were simply outreach to the poor in England. And then finally, their churches, they formed congregations and called them corps, C-O-R-P-S. Their ministers are called military officers of different ranks, and the believers, members, were called soldiers. They have no baptism. They do not observe communion, but they are a very important part of evangelical Christianity because they do tremendous work in outreach to the poor, to those who are affected by disaster, and so on. Well, and a Canadian Presbyterian, a minister by the name of Albert B. Simpson, organized what is now called the Christian and Missionary Alliance, 宣道会. He actually began by calling people from different denominations to go abroad, go overseas, and spread the gospel in Africa, in China, and later on, particularly in Vietnam and many other places. But then after a while, the home base, the sending prayer groups became churches. So they became known as the Christian and Missionary Alliance, 宣道会. We Chinese Christians are quite familiar with this denomination. Well, the brethren from England went to China, and so did many other missionaries that did not want to be sent by their own denomination to go to China. So these brethren and other denominational ministers who went to China, not to forget Hudson Taylor's China Inland Mission, those churches, the brethren, the China Inland Mission, fruits of their work, became independent churches. Today we might call them house churches in China, or gospel halls, 福音堂. Some of them are brethren, some of them are not. And so they became a kind of a non-denominational movement. Among the Reformed churches, finally, there are groups that hold special views. For example, they only sing psalms. Those are called the Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America. So that would be a seventh factor why there are denominations even within the Scottish Presbyterian Church. So here are some historical factors. Well, Jesus grieves over division of the church on earth. However, some of the historical factors make these divisions almost inevitable. Such is the fact of sinners living in the world.